Okay, good morning everyone. Can I welcome everyone to the 27th meeting and final meeting of 2019 of the Social Security Committee, and remind everyone present to turn mobile phones or other devices to silent mode so they don't disturb our meeting. Beautifully timed, Mr Griffin. No apologies have been received, and we now move to agenda item 1, subordinate legislation. The committee will take evidence on the Social Security Assistance Investigation of Offences Scotland Regulations 2020 draft, which is subject to the affirmative procedure. And can I welcome Shirley Ann Somerville, Cabinet Secretary for Social Security and Older People. Good morning, Ms Somerville, and can I also welcome your team this morning, Meg Fowler, Head of Fraud and Error Resolution Division, Social Security Scotland, Paul Curtis, Team Lead, Fraud, Overpayments and Operating Policy, and Colin Brown, Senior Principal Legal Officer, Scottish Government. Thank you everyone for coming along this morning to support our scrutiny. Can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement?
Good morning, Convener, and thank you for the invitation to come along today. As you will all be aware, the Social Security Scotland Act 2018 contains a number of offences that may be committed by individuals or organisations. Section 75 of the Act allows the Scottish Ministers to make regulations to facilitate investigation of those offences. It is those regulations that I would like to focus on today. Social Security is an investment in the people of Scotland, and the Scottish Government is fully committed to ensuring that every client is treated with dignity, fairness and respect at all times. We start from the premise that everyone may be entitled to support. However, we have to accept that attempts will be made to defraud the Scottish Social Security system, and we have a duty to protect public funds. That said, I know that fraud in Social Security is low. Latest DWP figures show that the total estimated loss to fraud is £2.3 billion per year. That's 2.7% of benefit expenditure excluding pensions. 320 million of this, or 0.37%, is related to fraud in disability and carer benefits, compared to tax evasion, which was estimated by HMRC at 5.3 billion in 2017-18. You can see that it is a relatively small number of cases. However, prevention is always better than cure, and Social Security Scotland, as outlined in their counter-fraud strategy, are focusing on the development of preventative controls to reduce opportunities for fraud to take place. But in those cases where fraud may have occurred, we must be able to investigate, gather evidence and take action where appropriate. This is entirely consistent with the principles of respect for dignity of individuals, efficiency and value for money laid out in the Social Security Act. I believe these regulations are proportionate and necessary. They will allow Social Security Scotland to gather information to differentiate between those who make a genuine error and those who seek to gain assistance they are not entitled to in the most efficient and least intrusive way possible. Gathering of information will always be undertaken by trained professionals with the appropriate skills, and they will proceed with the presumption of innocence in all cases. We have also been very clear throughout the development of these regulations that those making genuine mistakes will never be criminalised, and I would like to reiterate that here today. As part of the development of these regulations, the Scottish Government undertook a public consultation. Since that time, we have worked very closely with a range of stakeholders to understand the wide-ranging views that were raised, and we have amended the regulations where appropriate following that feedback. A number of respondents to the consultation noted concerns about the regulatory power to require information, including information held in electronic formats. They were concerned about the possible negative impacts that this could have upon the relationship between welfare rights organisations and their clients. While I want to be absolutely clear that there was never the intention behind the regulations to do this or to otherwise inhibit individuals from seeking support, we have absolutely listened to those concerns and amended the regulations accordingly. They can be reassured that they will not be expected to provide any information shared between welfare rights organisations and individuals seeking their support. A number of welfare rights organisations were also concerned that the regulations would allow their premises to be searched against their will. Again, let me be very clear that this is categorically not the case. When gathering evidence, Social Security Scotland must seek permission from the occupiers of any premises before entry and before any search can take place. They may not enter any dwelling house or any part of a premises used solely as living accommodation. Some stakeholders were also concerned that by protecting the relationship between themselves and their clients, they may unwittingly be in breach of the regulation relating to delay and obstruction of an investigation. The regulations now make it explicit that any delay or obstruction must be carried out deliberately. This, combined with the exemptions I referred to earlier, should assuage any concerns in relation to unwittingly committing an offence. Finally, I would like to draw your attention to Section 76 of the Act, which requires Scottish ministers to develop a code of practice for investigations. This code lays out how the regulations will be used in practice and what individuals can expect if a fraud investigation takes place. As much of the code relates directly to the content of the regulations, it cannot be finalised until the regulations have been approved by the Parliament. However, I have provided a draft copy to the committee to provide a wider context upon how the regulations will be used and aid the committee in their scrutiny of the regulations. I'm of course happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And just before we move to questions, just to remind members and myself, I suppose, of the process. After questions, there will be a short formal debate, so if any members want to speak at length of any aspect of it, as opposed to a specific question, we'll have that opportunity at the next agenda item. Okay, first question from Alison Johnson, MSP.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning. While I accept that the system is still developing, I'm just wondering what consideration was given to being more specific about what kinds of information and what organisations the agency might need to approach, going off what you now know to be necessary, and then bring new regulations later if these need to be expanded, you know, if eligibility criteria changes, for example, because I think one of the major concerns that has been raised about the regulations is whether or not they have been drawn too broadly, and there's obviously been a concern raised. The main concern was with the power to request information from any person. You know, just how broad is any person? Are we talking about GPs, for example?
Well, certainly when it comes to how the regulations have been developed, one of the differences between what the regulations for DWP have, for example, and what the Scottish system has, is the DWP has a list of organisations to which they can approach. Now that was considered but rejected for a number of reasons, and it very much is because we are in the process of setting up our social security system, and these things will develop and change over time. But they may develop and change very quickly as we move through the regulatory developments for example, disability and carers. So this aspect allows the agency to be ready on day one for the regular payments that will come from Wave 2. Will give them the ability to look into suspected fraud cases should they require to do so, and to do that in a flexible manner. The exemptions, however, are very, very important, and those were drawn up after the concerns were raised by some third sector organisations in particular, to ensure that there is no concern that we could seek information, for example, from a welfare rights organisation, etc., from where a person has gained support. So the exemptions that I detailed in my opening remarks are the limitations of that power. So anyone can be approached, with the exception of those types of organisations that I mentioned, for example, welfare rights organisations, women's refugees and so on as well.
So is it the case then, Cabinet Secretary, that medical records could be accessed in some cases?
Medical records can be accessed if it's determined that that is absolutely necessary. But one of the important aspects is that it must be relevant to the matter where the investigation is taking place. So it would be wholly inappropriate, and it would not happen under these regulations that a person's entire medical records could be asked for or should be received. It's about if there's a specific area within medical records that relates to the actual matter under investigation. So it must be reasonable for the authorised officer to require that information for it to be in connection with the investigation. and it absolutely has to be a relevant matter to that investigation. Now, obviously, when we're looking at the types of benefits which we will have under the devolved settlement, many of them will be around disability, for example, and therefore the ability to access some medical information, if it's reasonable and relevant, it may be a very, very proper aspect to do. However, it would obviously be decided on a case-by-case basis, and that's not something that would happen for every case. That would be up to the officers to decide whether that was appropriate.
And will applicants for these benefits be aware that their personal information, including perhaps a part of their medical records, may be accessed at some point in the future? If an investigation is regarded as essential?
It is certainly there within the privacy notices that we have as we move forward with the different benefits. So it is there when applicants sign up, and that is something which is part of that process of application.
Okay. On the on the area of whether or not the person under investigation, if someone is under investigation, and what is your view on the importance of that person understanding that they have been under investigation? Because I am concerned that they may not appreciate that that has even occurred, and that therefore makes it difficult for them to raise any concerns they might have about that.
Sure, I do appreciate that, and it is something that there has been discussions around. Obviously, if someone is aware that an investigation has taken place, then they would clearly be informed of the conclusion of that investigation, so that there is a line drawn under that, or indeed if there has been a decision to move that case forward, then they would be informed of that decision. I think what I would ask committee to bear in mind is that there are a number of, for example, vexatious claims that are made against people, that it may be actually concerning and upsetting for people to know that those types of complaints have went in against them. The vast majority of complaints under the current system don't then move forward to actually proceedings taking place. So it may be something which internally to staff has looked a little different, a little peculiar, and has been looked into, but actually there was nothing in it at all, and the investigation was closed very, very quickly. Maybe that's some more investigation was looked at, and again, there was nothing decided. So I think when you look at the number of instances where, quite rightly, the system looks, it reassures itself that nothing's untoward has happened, and then no further investigations take place, and certainly no charges are laid, or etc. That in many of those cases, it may be quite concerning and upsetting for the individual to know that those investigations have taken place.
And will annual statistics be published as to the number of investigations that have taken place and the outcomes of these?
We certainly will look very, very closely at that, because I think it is one of those areas where people will want to ensure that there is a great deal of public scrutiny to ensure that we're getting that balance right. And I think it is particularly important in fraud and error, which we of course deal with separately within the agency, because we need to be able to ensure that we're demonstrating dignity, fairness and respect in everything that we do, and that absolutely involves cases around fraud and error as well. So there were aspects within the annual report for the agency that came out. Obviously, we were at an exceptionally early stage given the time frame for that annual report, and those we will obviously have to have much further detail as we move on. Now, we're still looking at what type of detail that would include, but I'm certainly very determined, and I know the agency is very determined, to show how these powers are being used, or more importantly, when they're not being used, to allay any concerns that there are out there, to be able to demonstrate how we are using these how we're using our powers responsibly. So I would certainly look to have a very, very transparent way for the committee, for Parliament, for stakeholders to be able to access information on the types of investigations that have taken place, the numbers of obviously of fraud cases that have been determined and looked at. One of the aspects which I quite would like to pull out, Convener, as well, is the importance so that we won't be setting targets on this, because targets tend to drive behaviour in many ways. So the fact that an investigation is looked at and fraud hasn't taken place, that is also a good outcome of that fraud investigation. And I think it's important that we don't set targets to find a number of fraud cases in a year, or we drive through, because I think that can drive behaviour in many ways that's not good for the client. So what we will be doing is looking at how we can present that information, but never ever drive behaviour in a way that would be detrimental to the clients concerned.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Alison Johnson. Really important line of questioning. We've got some supplementaries I know members want. Can I just ask one part of clarity in relation to Alison Johnson's line of questioning in terms of the person under investigation being aware that an investigation is taking place? Fully accept the point you make, Cabinet Secretary, about vexatious complaints and the stress that could place on individuals, given the vast majority of complaints and benefit fraud are found to be have no case. I think it's over 80% or something, like a really significantly high number. There is absolutely no case to answer. But within that exchange was something around making sure the person under investigation has the ability to tell their story. So if an investigation into fraud is progressing and that investigation is, establishes there could be some substantial concerns there, will the person under investigation always have their opportunity to give their side of the story ahead of any determination into the fraud case?
Well, absolutely, Convener. I mean, I think it is absolutely integral that that happens in every case. So if the investigation comes to an end because there's no fraud that's been determined to have taken place, then that's very, very different to if the case is moving forward. And actually, in every circumstance, then that individual must have the right to explain those circumstances. A very, very important part of that might be because when you're actually being when you actually have that opportunity as a client to be able to come forward, you may very well be able to demonstrate that this was a genuine error that took place, that you will be able to demonstrate and explain the circumstances and when it took place. So that ability to interview clients under caution is exceptionally important for them to be able to explain the context and, as I say, if there's any genuine error that's taken place, it's absolutely imperative that they get the opportunity to be able to discuss that in detail. And I go back to the point I made in my original statement that it is absolutely done on the provision of a person being innocent as we go through that process. And that's very, very important that they're given that opportunity.
Okay, thank you. Pauline McNeill.
Thank you. Good morning. Just a supplementary on Alison Johnson's line of questioning, which you answered about medical records, which was helpful. I just wanted to just go a little bit further. So I'm clear that you've said that it's not a fishing trip that the investigating officer can go on. It's a specific request for specific information, and then when that's received by the medical professional, they will respond in good faith to the question that has been asked of them. So my supplementary is, should a medical doctor respond to what they think they're being asked, and narrowing down the scope of the information, which I presume doctors will want to make sure that they've answered the question and also protect their patients at the same time from giving everything that perhaps. Will that answer be accepted by the investigating officer in good faith? Or can the investigating officer come back and challenge the doctor? You've not given me what I've asked for. I'm just I just want to be clear, because I don't want medical professionals to get in the firing line. If they've answered in good faith, perhaps that should just be accepted as their answer, but it'd be helpful.
Well, I think part of the responsibility of the agency is to ensure that they are exceptionally clear about what information they're asking for and what they're not asking for. So if they're asking again about what's relevant to a matter and what's reasonable to be asked for, then it is absolutely the responsibility of the agency to be exceptionally clear in that. Now, if the agency has done that correctly, then there is then an absolute appreciation that the GP or whoever that request is going to will answer to the best of their ability for the information that's required. So I think there's a lot of responsibility on the agency to actually get the questions right and to get that absolutely detailed, and then we'll get the right information back at all. You're absolutely right to point out this isn't a fishing exercise that can be taken out to just see what we could find, and that again points to the importance of getting that initial contact with the GP or whoever that may be, and given the professionalism of those that are taking part in this, then they will be, I'm sure, doing this in good faith and answering to the best of their ability on that. Now, it may be that doesn't bring the matter to a close. It may be that the officer then thinks they don't have all the information required just because it may have not been in the medical records, or so they may then go elsewhere or may continue the investigation. But that's not to say that the initial query went wrong in any way. It may just be that the officer at that point feels that there may be further information that's required from another source. But it all has to be reasonable to be asked for. We can't just continue an investigation for the sake of it.
Thank you.
Okay, Mark Griffin, supplementary as well.
Yep. Thanks, Camino. I wanted to come back to the people who can be required to give information. I think it's fair to say that was the biggest area of concern in the consultation. And I take fully on board what the Cabinet Secretary is saying. I appreciate Scottish Social Security is in its infancy, and accept completely the reasons that the Cabinet Secretary has given it that list of people who can be required to give information would be broad at this point. But I think it would give me some assurance, and people who responded to the consultation some assurance, if the Cabinet Secretary was able to say that the broad nature of these regulations would only be temporary, and that when social security payments are developing further, that the agency could confidently give a list of organisations that could be required to give information, that the Cabinet Secretary would give a commitment to come back and revert from this broad approach to a much more defined list.
Well, we are absolutely determined to ensure that this system works, and it has to work, importantly, not just for the agency, but for the clients and for the stakeholders. One of the reasons why, to be frank, since the consultation, we have taken our time before presenting the regulations to the committee and to Parliament, is because there were a number of concerns raised, particularly around the different way that this has been organised rather than having a specific list. And that's why the exemptions that I've spoken about earlier were so important in that. I do believe that we've taken account of the concerns that the third sector organisations had and other stakeholders had on this point. I think we've reached an area where, because of the way the regulations are drafted, those restrictions on the power to require information are the correct method to ensure that there's no unintended consequences to that list. Now, this method of not having a list as per the DWP is something, for example, which is comparable to what's in the Revenue Scotland and Tax Powers Act 2014, which also doesn't have a list. So this is not something which has been the first time that this has been done for the devolution of powers. This is something which is already in place for that Act. But I think the fact that we have added we've added those exceptions in does demonstrate that we've listened to the concerns that we've had, and we've really taken our time to go through in specific detail the nuances of specific concerns, for example, around women's refuge spaces and so on as well.
Yeah, but I appreciate that the consultation was listened to and those exceptions have been put in place. It's purely because you yourself have given the reason for drafting regulations in this way, as social security payments in Scotland being in their infancy and still developing. So it was an assumption that since that was a reason given for drafting them in this way, that as the government and the agency become more experienced, that there would or could be an opportunity to reflect and scale back to a more appropriate list.
Certainly, as with many of these areas, we are always open to see whether what's been in place right from the start is the correct way in going forward once there's a kind of steady state operation. Now, there's nothing to say or to suggest to me that there's a requirement once we move to steady state that there would be as a requirement to move to a list, but we do have a commitment to review these aspects after 2 years. That will certainly involve obviously an examination of how these regulations work, particularly this regulation where we don't have a DWP type list. So at that point, 2 years on, once we've had the regular payment disability and carers packages in for that amount of time, that will give us a good ability to see whether indeed steady state does require us to have something different. So I hope there is a reassurance that that review will be an ability for us to reflect on the evidence that we have at that point, to see what stakeholders are feeling about how these regulations are working in practice. If there's any changes to be made after that, obviously they can be made. I don't think there's a necessity to change once we move to steady state, but hopefully that review gives a reassurance that's an ability at that point, once we've got that 2 years experience kind of under the agency's belt.
Okay, thanks, Cabinet Secretary.
Can I just check a couple of things on that, Cabinet Secretary? So by summer 2021, we're moving over to any fresh assessments for disability assistance for adults will be rolling out at roughly around that point, and that then has to bed in as well, of course, to see how the Code of Practice, which is still to be drafted, and the various regulations we're hopefully agreeing today work in practice. When you mentioned 2 years, would it be and I'm not hung up whether it's 18 months or 3 years. I'm not trying to pick a number for the sake of picking a number, Cabinet Secretary. Just was the point I'm trying to get to is, are we talking about a couple of years after the final benefit of phase 2 comes in, so a couple of years after disability assistance for adults is implemented, or are we talking about 2 years from what is the kind of starting gun in relation to that, I suppose, is what I'm asking. Apologies
if I wasn't clear, Convener. It's 2 years from when the regulations passed.
All
it's
right.
Certainly our way that we're working towards.
Okay, that's helpful. Also in terms of the reassurances offered this morning in terms about how GPs will or won't release medical data as appropriate to authorised investigating officers, will best practice be contained within the Code of Practice in relation to that particular element as well? And of course, just because a Code of Practice exists doesn't mean that GPs are necessarily aware of what the expectations are on GPs and what the limitations in their sharing of medical information should be. So will there be guidance available to GPs to allow them to make but they'll make their informed professional views irrespective of what guidance is out there, I suspect, because they're fierce defenders of the medical records of their patients anyway. But will there be some supportive guidance given to GPs proactively rather than waiting to the first time they get an authorised investigating officer asking for specific information?
Well, I think I would go back to the point that I made earlier on about our responsibility to get that initial contact right with a GP. I mean, these cases will vary greatly from case by case. So the important aspect is that our agency officers are exceptionally well trained and ensure that they're using their code of practice and the guidance that's there for them to be able to shape their approaches to, as I say, a GP or whoever they would be moving towards. It's probably difficult to set out guidance for other professions because it will absolutely vary on a case-by-case basis. But there is an absolute requirement on us to make it, I suppose, as easy as possible for people to be able to take part in this process and not feel that it's overburdensome with them. The way that I think we can do that to the best of our ability is to ensure that we are having regular engagement with, for example, professional bodies and the NHS to ensure that they are entirely up to speed with what's being proposed, what's within the regulations, and how that would develop, and be able to have that constant feedback from them. So again, I hope that provides reassurance that we're certainly not doing this in a vacuum within the agency, but the agency is very much going out and ensuring that they are discussing these matters with relevant agencies, relevant professional bodies and relevant stakeholders that may be impacted upon them.
And it's good to get it on the record this morning, Cabinet Secretary. We'll move to the next line of questioning from Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Convener. You've touched on some of the reasons why it would seem you're avoiding what might be called target-based activity, I think. But can you elaborate on your thinking behind that and whether you consider that the issues around that?
Well, it is very, very important that we are exceptionally targeted in what we do. That includes who we approach. That includes very much the cases that are taken on. There will be requirements for the agency to look into cases where, for example, an approach has been made internally by a member of staff. There will be times where an approach is made to the agency by an individual outside, a member of the public, and those are where we'll ensure that we'll investigate. But there absolutely will be no target-based activity in relation to fraud. I suppose the obvious reason for that is it's very, very difficult to see how you can have fairness, dignity and respect at the same time as doing that. So we've restricted the remit of investigators to that of expert evidence gatherers. All the decision making will take place outside that investigation team. So again, there's a kind of separation in responsibilities there. So as we build through, let's say, all those different aspects of the system, which I've highlighted at a high level there, that will hopefully ensure that we are absolutely reassuring people that we'll carry out investigations only when it's deemed necessary, only to the extent that it's deemed necessary as well, again to ensure that that fairness, dignity and respect is there.
Well, on that issue, or indeed on any other issue, can I ask, have you responded to or reflected on the views that you gained through your meetings with stakeholders and experience panels in the process of coming forward with these regulations?
Very much so. I think this was one of the areas where, as I say, right at the start, I knew that we would have a particular challenge to be able to reassure people that you can have dignity and fairness and respect in a fraud system just as you can in any other part of the system. So we have taken our time to look at the areas where there was concern. One of the areas which we've discussed already is the requirement for exemptions for certain types of organisations, and I really would like to thank the organisations that have taken part in those detailed discussions that have went through their particular circumstances, because as with all of these things, there may be unintended consequences to the drafting of regulations, or indeed certainly not a way that this government, or I would hope any government, would use regulations, but they could be misused or misinterpreted in the future. So it's that ability to future-proof these, to ensure that we're not just sitting there going, well, we wouldn't use it like that, so please be reassured by this. But how do you absolutely draft all of those unintended potential consequences out of that? So there's been a great deal of work with stakeholders. There's also obviously been extensive work with the Crown Office, with the Procurator Fiscal Service as well, and indeed with the Information Commissioner's Office too. So we have tried very, very hard to ensure that we've taken the genuine and legitimate concerns that stakeholders in particular had at the start of this process and amended the regulations to, I hope, alleviate the concerns that they had.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, we'll move to Michelle Ballantyne now.
Good morning. I just want to look at the data side within the actual regulation itself, and it's more a query around the way in which it's phrased, and just to check why it's phrased that way. There may be a very logical explanation I've just missed. So if I could refer you to part 3, section 4.3, and it's repeated again in section 7.6.
A little bit slower as
Yeah,
I move
sorry.
to the right part of the folder.
Yeah.
Part
So it's the actual regulation itself, and part 3,
Yep.
and it's item 4.3, and repeated again at 7.6, and it's to do with the disposal of data during or after an investigation. And what it says in the actual regulation is that an authorised officer must destroy any information received in response to such a notice as soon as it ceases to be needed in connection with the matters that may be investigated. And that same phrasing is repeated at 7.6. In your draft guidance regulations under data, it actually says that when the investigation or related action has concluded, the documents and evidence gathered will be retained and destroyed in line with Social Security Scotland's data retention policy. So it's really just to ask why the use of the language in the regulation sort of suggests that as soon as it ceases to need it with matters that may be investigated.
Well, I think if there's any confusion or dubiety around it, we're happy to look at the draft code of practice to see whether any of that can be resolved at that point. I mean, I don't know if, Colin, you want to say something particularly about the drafting, but when it comes to the code, if there's any dubiety or if there's any concern that there's a contradiction there, that can absolutely be looked at because it's the draft.
Well, the code makes sense to me that you destroy everything once you've completed your investigation. It was just the wording in the regulation seemed to suggest that.
I think the regulation may be worded simply say there may be cases where that would happen sooner.
Yeah.
There may be an ongoing investigation, and actually the information received may have no bearing on the ongoing investigation, and it would therefore simply not be retained.
So an example might be, I'll go back to Paul and McNeill's references to medical records. We might get something through, the agency might get something through that's not actually relevant to the investigation, and that needs to be destroyed before the conclusion of the investigation because it's nothing to do with the investigation. So we might get information, we might not have asked for it, but the agency might get information that requires to be destroyed earlier than the end of the process.
All right. But then that covers everything, including the how you handle data, everything that is used in the investigation as well. Because it didn't seem to sort of say that. I mean, it may be that it does. It was just when I was reading it.
We'll certainly reflect upon that, and we'll see whether any requirements or changes to be made to the code at that point.
Okay, thank you.
was just, I think I'm just repeating what you've said, Cabinet Secretary, for clarity for the official report. Are you confident that any lack of clarity in the statute instrument can be resolved with clarity in the Code of Practice?
I don't think there is any lack of clarity in the regulations. The regulations can state that data can be destroyed earlier than the end of an investigation. For example, if it's not relevant, then it absolutely should be destroyed before the end of the investigation. Not everything should be kept necessarily until right at the end of an investigation. So I'm certainly content that the drafting allows the destroying of any information if it's required to do so during it, and then allows us to be able to take the necessary steps once an investigation has been completed and closed as well.
And what the Code of Practice can do is illustrate when it would be appropriate to do those things, but the powers contained within the instrument itself.
We can certainly look to see whether further drafting is required on that point.
Okay, are there any? Of course you can.
Yeah, because it doesn't actually specifically say in the regulations that all documentation must be destroyed on the conclusion of the investigation. It just says that as it ceases to be needed in connection with matters that may be investigated.
So if there's a prosecution, we're obviously obliged to retain it until that point, but under wider legislative requirements, nobody can keep data if they're not required and not needing the data under data protection.
So your clarification is really that the regulation over the control of data subsequently is contained elsewhere rather than needs to be contained in this regulation?
Yes.
That's fine. Thank you.
Michelle, are there any other questions to Cabinet Secretary before we move to the next agenda item? Okay, there being no other questions, we'll now move to agenda item 2. And can I invite Ms Somerville to move S5M 20206 that the Social Security Committee recommends that Social Security Assistance Investigation Events in Scotland Regulation 2020 in draft form be approved. So can you just move the motion at this point?
Moves, convener.
Okay. Now, this can be a bit artificial at times, Cabinet Secretary, I know, but there's the opportunity for debate, and members may wish the opportunity to put some general reflections on the record at this point, and you have the opportunity to sum up at the end of that debate. I should point out that your officials at this point cannot participate in that. Are there any points that members would like to make at this point within the debate? Alison Johnson.
Yes, I would like to, convener. Thank you. Most appreciative of the evidence we've heard this morning. I think it's really important that we conduct any anti-benefit fraud in a way that doesn't over-exaggerate the scale of the problem. And I think the Cabinet Secretary highlighted some 2.7%, where a TUC poll a few years ago suggested that members of the public thought this was occurring in 27% of the cases. So it is small, and I also welcome your assurance, Cabinet Secretary, that targets won't be set in this regard. But I have concerns that do remain. I have concerns that people have the right to know whether an investigation has taken place, regardless of the outcome. And I'm concerned that without this information, there's does this really respect a person's right to privacy? I think the Code of Practice is clear that investigations must be proportionate, but if you're unaware that you've been or are being investigated, you can't challenge that proportionality. And the Information Commissioner's Office has said that an individual should be made aware that an investigation was conducted. And I think particularly in a case where even a small part of your medical records may have been investigated, I think it's really important that an individual is aware of that. I appreciate too the fact that the agency has been clear about the need to distinguish between fraud and errors in a sympathetic manner. But I think for me, one of the main concerns here, Mark Griffin asked, if it would be possible that this broad nature, the broad scope, would only be temporary before we move to a defined list. And I think I'm still off the view, as CPAG were when they responded to the consultation, and I appreciate that exceptions have been made as a result of evidence from Inclusion Scotland and so on, but I remain unconvinced that starting off with this broad list is wholly necessary or the right way to do it. And also with regards to who will be carrying out the investigation. I mean, I think training here is obviously absolutely key, but I do have concerns about whether or not there are sufficient safeguards in place with regards to the individuals who will be accessing this information. And yeah, just concerns about excessive use of powers to request information. I think in summary, my main concern is with the power to require information from anyone, albeit with that list of exceptions. I think I'll leave it at that, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Polly McNeill.
Thank you, and I was satisfied with most of what Cabinet Secretary had to say today. I think it's quite difficult to make an assessment of whether you're satisfied with everything, because we're setting a framework, we don't know how it's going to operate in practice, and to that extent I think Alison Johnson's perfectly correct to raise the issues that she has. It's all down to, I suppose, the leadership of the management of the service itself and the tone that's set for what the test is going to be. As you rightly say, it is a reasonable test, and I think I would like to keep a close eye on the future, or the committee, whoever they are, should keep a close eye on whether or not the reasonable test, as an ordinary person would see, is being complied with. Something that I raised during the passage of the bill was my concerns around the framing of the offences themselves, where the wording, something like known or ought to have known. I expressed my concerns about that phraseology, and I did it also on behalf of a group of lawyers who were not convinced that that was quite a low test and quite a fine line between error and fraud. I just would like to put on the record that I still remain concerned about the framing of the offence alongside the framing of the legislation and rules around investigation of fraud, and I just think someone needs to return to that to ensure that it is the end, if you like, the end point is as we envisage it to be.
Okay, thank you. Jeremy Balfour.
Thank you, Convener. Can I first of all thank the Cabinet Secretary and her team for drawing these up. I mean, I actually think they're very helpful. I think they strike the balance just about right between being able to investigate in a proper way, but also providing the individual with that. I suppose, having sat on tribunals and heard the final outcome of these cases, you do need to have some kind of power to investigate without the person known initially. And I think actually having no list is actually a better way forward, because it will give the investigation officer the freedom to be able to go where he or she thinks the investigation has to go. But I also do welcome the Cabinet Secretary's commitment that there will be a 2-year review of this, because I think it will probably will need tweaked. You know, no system is perfect, and it will be helpful for whoever is here in 2 years' time to be able to have a look at what has actually happened in practice and see if those tweaks are necessary. But I do think the tone and the direction of travel is absolutely correct. If I could just use this opportunity so I can put on the record, as the Convener likes to say, I do think going forward, and this is a role for us as a committee as well as for the Cabinet Secretary, I do think we do need to have separate sessions where we take evidence 1 week and are able to reflect on it, and rather than just voting immediately. And I would hope that the clerks and the Cabinet Secretary's team can diary that in a certain way, because there may well be regulations coming down the line that there are more questions that we'd want to discuss in private afterwards, and obviously we don't have that opportunity. So I in no way making any point. I just think it's for the committee and for the Cabinet Secretary's team to make sure that's properly in the diaries, that we can have a gap between hearing evidence and then making a decision, because I think it is too close doing it on the same day. But I, again, just thank our officials for the work that they've put into this.
Okay, are there any other comments from members at the stage? Keith Brown.
Just on that last point, I assume it's open to members of the committee to defer a decision if it comes up for a further period, so you could have that further. I don't know, but I'm less concerned about that. Although I agree with the bulk of what Jeremy Balfour's just said. I think it's the right balance that's there, and I think the point that's been made previously, I think there's something in our notes that says that in relation to PIP payments, fraud is around 1.6%, and also that 89% of cases of alleged disability benefit fraud were found to be non-fraudulent after examination by the DWP. So I think the point that the Cabinet Secretary made at the start about the comparison between fraud of the benefit system as compared to tax evasion, it's a fraction of what we have in tax evasion. Nevertheless, I think it's very important to people that they've got faith in the system and that fraud is properly tackled. And I don't have the same concern with saying any person. I'm not sure who you'd want to exempt from an investigation into a fraudulent activity. I'm not sure who you know, what list you would drop to say this person shouldn't answer questions about potential fraud of public funds. So I'm less concerned about that. I do share Alison Johnston's concern about the idea that I'm trying to think what the point was that you made. I shared the concern about, and I can't read my own writing, convener. So there was a point that Alison made which I think was very important, which I can't remember just now, and I do share that concern. Oh, that was the point. And I do think, General Balfour's right to say initially there may be a case for not doing that, but I do think if you've been investigated, you'll certainly know about it if you think there's something there anyway, because they'll take it to the through due process. But if they don't find anything, why shouldn't the person be told? And I think that's also consistent with the point about getting rid of data which have accumulated during the course of the investigation, which you don't need. I think you should be really rigorous in doing that. It's a bit like the new power to forget, if you like. So I think that's very important. But on balance, I think we should be rigorous and vigorous with fraud. I think people expect that. I wish we were much more so in relation to tax evasion. But so I'm very encouraged both by the approach that's been taken and the fact there's going to be a review in 2 years' time to see how we take it forward.
Thank you very much, Keith. If no other member wants to speak, I might say make a few comments before the Cabinet Secretary sums up. Just in terms of Mr Balfour's point, it's really a kind of housekeeping point for the committee how we choose to scrutinise these statutory instruments. I'm minded we've got on our agenda for our first committee meeting back in the new year, we've got a work programme meeting scheduled then, and it was for the committee, as we always do, to decide how we decide to scrutinise statutory instruments as they come forward. Had the committee decided to take 2 evidence sessions in relation to this, that would be the committee's ability to do that, and the government, as always, would respond positively, I'm sure. So I think that's wholly a committee matter as opposed to a government matter in relation to this discussion. I wasn't going to mention fraud, Mr Brown, but I was struck when you were making those comments about, again, asserting how low level fraud is within the benefit system, within PIP and DLA in particular. And when I think of PIP and DLA and fraud, what I think is the injustice to my constituents who are being wholly unsuitably assessed inaccurately and incorrectly or with punitive guidance and not getting the decisions that they absolutely deserve. And what this new system will actually do is put a much fairer set of regulations in place so that people are actually getting the decisions that their medical conditions dictate. So when I hear fraud, I think about the fraud committed upon our disabled community who are not getting the justice that they deserve in relation to how disability benefits are being conducted by the UK government currently, quite frankly. In relation to the statutory instrument before us, there was 3 points that I did want to make. I thought it was really interesting that debate between putting on the face of a bill specifically who an investigating officer can contact as part of that investigation, or having that as a broad power, but then bringing in limitations and restrictions as appropriate, as the Scottish Government has done in relation to advice and advocacy services. And I think what I heard from the Cabinet Secretary is that she's absolutely open-minded to adding to that list of restrictions as appropriate, but anyway, taking stock in 2 years about whether to review that list or put something on the face of legislation. So I think the door's not closed on that, so I'm content that the government's enlisting mode in relation to that. Also, I would hope in any review there would be a review of how medical data has actually been used by GPs and what GPs think about how that's worked a couple of years down the line. I think that would be quite important as well to look at. And finally, I mean, I've got huge sympathy with what Alison Johnston was saying about people individually being alerted to investigations about alleged fraud. also know from my casework that a lot of very vulnerable people who might get vexatious claims against them maybe unnecessarily stressed and made anxious about fraud claims with no substance, but do they have a right to know? And there's a balance to be drawn there. I'd be very interested to know what the experience panels would think about that, what people living with disabilities who are looking to put in a new claim or have their claim reassessed, how they would feel about if allegations of fraud that were vexatious were made about them. Would they want to know, irrespective of how anxious that made them feel? So, I think it's about empowering the claimants to work out what works best for them. So hopefully in the review process that could be considered as well. But broadly, I'm pleased that the government's got the balance right, and as Jeremy Balfour did, can I thank yourself, Cabinet Secretary, and your officials for getting us to this stage. And can I pass to yourself, Cabinet Secretary, for to sum up the debate that we've just held here this morning.
Thank you, Convener. I'll just make a few brief remarks. As you rightly said, Convener, it is up to the committee to determine their own timetable, and I will absolutely and always come when asked, whenever the committee decides they wish me to be here, and how that evidence is, they wish for me to give that evidence to committee. So I'm entirely in their hands on that process. I think much of what we've discussed within that small debate, I think, sums up one of the challenges we have about establishing a system from scratch, and therefore the absolute necessity for government to be willing to look at how that has worked after a couple of years. And I say that often when I come to committee, that because particularly we are doing things from scratch, there is an absolute responsibility on government to be open to different approaches, different ways of doing things, and to reflect on how things have worked in practice. As I said, I don't think it necessitates change as we move to steady state, but I'm certainly not sitting here in full defence saying things would never change, and we certainly always have to be open to looking at that. This is one of the areas where I think there is particular challenge, because we have nothing to compare it to in terms of comparing it to a system that runs with dignity, fairness and respect in it. And I think that's the test that we will all have to hold this to. And I think that obviously includes the agency and government looking at it as well. The other aspect which ties into that is around transparency, whether it's around the statistics that we produce, or the fact that we need, again, to be very open about how these powers have been used, and will certainly reflect on the comments that have been made today as we move forward to the next annual report, for example, and the next batch of statistics that come forward. Just finally, on the right to know, you asked what the experience panels have said about that. I've just checked with my officials about that. It would be fair to say there was a very mixed response on that. There were some people who did think that would be something that would be a good idea, and there were others who clearly did point to the fact that it would actually make people more anxious, more concerned, more stressed if that was built into the system. It again ties back to that area where there's sometimes not a right, wrong, black, white answer to some of these things. It's a judgment call about how the decision's been made. But again, that's certainly something which, when we're looking at review processes, can be examined. I'm certainly very open to that process, as I often come to committee on these things.
Okay, thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. So we'll now move to the vote. So the question is that motion S5M 20206, that the Social Security Committee recommends that the Social Security Assistance Investigation of Offences Scotland Regulation 2020 draft be approved. Is the committee content to recommend approval of this instrument? Yes. Okay. Given that we're not content, as a committee, we'll now move to a vote. So can I ask those who are content to approve this motion to raise their hands now, please? Just wait till the clerk's recorded that.
Got it, thanks.
Okay. All those against approving the motion? Are there any abstentions? Okay. Got a note of that. Okay, well, that being the vote, the motion is approved, and that ends agenda item 2. Can I thank you, Cabinet Secretary and the officials, for coming along, and we'll, well, I should say Happy Christmas when it comes, of course, that's very remiss of me, but we do suspend briefly before we move to agenda item 3. Thank you. Okay, welcome back everyone. We now move to agenda item 3, subordinate legislation. Could I refer members to paper 4, the note by the clerk? The committee is invited to consider the Scottish Tribunal's eligibility for appointment amendment regulations 2019 SSI 2019/384, which is subject to the negative procedure. You may wish to remind... What do I want to remind here, Anne? You may, apparently I want to remind members that the principal regulations were considered by the committee in October last year. That was seamless, wasn't it? I'm sure you all remember that. So with that said, is the committee content to note these amending regulations?
Yes.
Okay. We now move to agenda item 4, which is decision on taking business in private. The committee is asked to agree that work programme discussions be taken in private at future meetings. Is the committee agreed? Okay, thank you. We now formally close the meeting. Thanks.